Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
When you look at like a skyscraper, the foundation is completely obvious.
Right.
You see the steel girders, the reinforced concrete, those massive glass panels, and your brain just sort of immediately processes the physics of it all. You can literally point at it and say, there it is. That's the thing holding this entire structure up.
Yeah, and I mean, that is a very, very comforting way to view the world, right? We inherently prefer that the forces shaping our reality are, well, visible. We want them categorized, labeled, and, easy to understand at just a passing glance.
But the reality of 2026 is it's entirely different. We are looking at a global landscape that is driven almost exclusively by forces operating completely out of sight.
Totally out of sight, yeah.
From the bottom of the ocean to like the quantum level of our own cells, the world is essentially being run by this hidden architecture.
And the thing is, if you only pay attention to those surface events, the breaking news alerts buzzing on your phone or the daily stock tickers, everything just feels incredibly chaotic.
Oh, it feels completely random.
Right, it feels random.
Yeah.
But when you start pulling back the floorboards to examine that unseen infrastructure, you start to realize it is this intensely interconnected system.
And that is exactly why we are here. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this right now, I know you are insanely curious. You're probably completely exhausted by the constant information overload of the modern news cycle. But you live for those genuine moments of clarity.
Those aha moments.
Exactly. So today we are tearing down the walls to look at the actual wiring of our world. We have a massive amount of ground to cover.
Yeah.
I mean, from the fragile geopolitical chess games happening in the Middle East to the literal coding of human DNA, all the way to the extreme physics keeping astronauts alive as they plummet back to Earth.
It is a lot.
Yeah, it's so much. And to help decode all of this, I have the ultimate guide here with me. So, okay, let's unpack this because the sheer scale of the mechanics we're about to explore is just staggering.
Well, let's just get right into it then.
Yeah, we have to start with the geopolitical tightrope that is currently dominating the global economy.
Right.
So we are looking at a 2-week ceasefire that was just brokered between the United States and Iran.
Right.
Now, Donald Trump's administration has claimed this pause in hostilities as a definitive diplomatic victory. They are framing it as a successful strong-arm tactic that, forces a necessary pause and creates a pathway to lasting peace.
And predictably, you have global analysts and political critics arguing the exact opposite.
Right. There's always the counter-narrative.
Yeah, from a left-leaning and internationalist perspective, this victory is being viewed as structurally hollow. The argument there is that a temporary pause does absolutely nothing to resolve the deep underlying tensions.
Because the core issues are still there.
Exactly. Particularly because Iran has simultaneously proposed this 10-point plan that basically demands a complete reshuffling of the deck.
Yeah, let's talk about the mechanics of that 10-point plan, because, these aren't just minor policy tweaks, right?
No, not at all.
Iran is demanding the complete withdrawal of United States troops from the region, and they want recognized, formalized control over the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf.
Which is, it's just a non-starter for Western powers.
It has to be.
Yeah. The Strait of Hormuz is the central artery of the global energy market. Handing over unilateral control of that choke point, that alters the entire power dynamic of the hemisphere.
Right.
But honestly, the most fascinating structural shift here isn't really the demands themselves. It is who is brokering the conversation.
Right. The mediator isn't the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland.
Oh.
It is Pakistan.
Yeah, which is a huge pivot.
It really is. We are expecting peace talks to take place in Islamabad, Pakistan this Friday, with high-profile figures from the U.S. side, including J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner, flying in. So why Pakistan? What is the strategic logic of moving the negotiating table completely away from traditional Western hubs?
Well, it signals a major transition into a multipolar world. Historically, Western powers dictated the terms of Middle Eastern diplomacy.
Right, that was just the standard operating procedure.
Exactly. But by stepping in, Pakistan is really leveraging its unique position. It has a very complex relationship with Washington, but it also shares a massive, porous border with Iran, and it maintains this delicate balance in the Islamic world.
So they have a foot in both camps, essentially.
Right. It suggests that regional powers are deciding that the old Western-led conflict resolution models are obsolete, and they are basically taking the architectural framework of diplomacy into their own hands.
But, practically speaking, I have to question the physics of a localized truce in an environment like this. It feels like we were trying to put out a grease fire on the stove while, the rest of the house is actively burning to the ground.
That is a very accurate analogy.
Right. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran might be signed on paper, but the spillover in the immediate vicinity is just severe.
Yeah, and the primary fracture point right now is Israel and Lebanon. The Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, have made it explicitly clear that this U.S.-Iran truce does not apply to their ongoing operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
And the numbers coming out of there are just difficult to process. We are talking about over 100 strikes in a span of just 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Across Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon, as well as the Bekaa Valley in the eastern part of the country, and across southern Lebanon.
And the reports indicate 254 people have been killed. The International Committee of the Red Cross has publicly stated they are outraged by the strikes, focusing heavily on the humanitarian toll.
Right, and you have European countries releasing these really strong statements, condemning the IDF strikes as unacceptable violations of international norms.
Meanwhile, officials in Tehran, Iran, are threatening to just completely scrap the two-week truce altogether.
Because they see it as connected.
Exactly. They're claiming the U.S. is essentially violating the spirit of the ceasefire by allowing its closest ally to continue these massive operations.
And, we are maintaining absolute neutrality on the politics of this, but looking strictly at the cause and effect, you can immediately see the shockwaves hitting the global economy.
Oh, absolutely.
When the ceasefire was first announced, the Dow Jones Industrial Average surged over 1,100 points.
Which was the best single day for the Dow since April of 2025.
Right. And oil prices tumbled below $95 a barrel.
Right.
But the second the allegations of ceasefire violations hit the wire and the strikes in Lebanon continued, stock futures dipped right back down.
It's instant.
Yeah. The financial markets are reacting in milliseconds to these geopolitical tremors.
Because what you are watching on those trading floors is the real-time calculation of the risk premium in global energy markets.
Okay, so break down the actual mechanics of a risk premium for me. How does an algorithmic trading bot, or even a human trader, calculate anxiety?
Right. It basically comes down to supply chain insurance. Let's look at the Strait of Hormuz again. When a trader buys a contract for 1 million barrels of oil, they aren't just paying for the physical crude liquid. They are analyzing the geographic path that oil must take to get to them.
The logistics of it.
Yeah. If Iran temporarily closes the strait or even just issues warnings for commercial ships to stay in their waters, the physical supply of oil globally hasn't actually dropped that very second.
Oil still exists.
Right. But the probability of a future disruption spikes dramatically. So buyers bid the price up because they are essentially paying a tax to guarantee their supply against potential future chaos.
Wow.
The risk premium is quite literally the monetary value of global anxiety.
Which perfectly explains why you have leaders like UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer coming out and explicitly stating that reopening the Strait of Hormuz is the single most critical factor for global economic stability right now.
Absolutely.
The UK is facing its own intense domestic economic pressures, and a 20% spike in energy costs due to a Middle Eastern risk premium could just severely damage their recovery.
And that anxiety is driving tangible physical changes in how nations defend themselves, too. Like, France just announced a staggering 36 billion euro boost to its military rearmament.
36 billion.
Euros, yes, which includes a massive expansion of its nuclear deterrent.
36 billion euros is a monumental pivot for a European nation. They're looking at the fragility of international agreements and deciding to basically build their own physical walls.
Right, but the definition of a wall in 2026 has completely changed. We are seeing a simultaneous global race to secure submarine internet cables from sabotage.
So we think of war as troops on the ground, but are we seeing a shift where the primary targets are now these global nervous systems like internet cables and trade choke points?
Yes. This is the absolute essence of modern asymmetric warfare. The military doctrine of the 20th century was all about amassing tanks at a physical border.
Right, very visible.
Exactly. But today, the most devastating strike you can launch against a sovereign nation isn't a bombing run on its capital. It is deploying a submersible to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to sever the fiber optic cables that carry its financial data.
Wait, if these cables are so critical, if they literally carry trillions of dollars in high-frequency trading data and secure government communications, how are they physically protected at the bottom of the ocean?
Well, the terrifying truth is, for the most part, they aren't.
You're kidding.
No, I mean, they are shielded by steel wire and polyurethane, sure, but that's just to protect against, like, shark bites and accidental ship anchors.
Wow.
They are incredibly vulnerable to targeted sabotage by state actors. Nations are suddenly waking up and realizing that the primary nervous system of the global economy is just lying exposed in international waters.
That is wild.
Yeah, and securing those cables requires a massive mobilization of naval resources, autonomous underwater vehicles, and highly advanced sonar tracking.
But building advanced submarines and autonomous drones and expanding nuclear deterrence, all of that requires something far more foundational than just diplomacy.
Right.
It requires raw physical materials. The irony here is that the high-tech architecture of 2026 is entirely dependent on digging massive holes in the ground.
Oh, absolutely. You cannot build a green energy grid or a modern military without rare earth elements. And right now, the geopolitical battle for those elements is forcing countries into some pretty extreme environmental compromises.
Yeah, let's look at South America. Lawmakers in Argentina, who are heavily backed by President Javier Milei, just passed a highly controversial bill to allow mining in the glacier regions of the Andes.
And this represents the brutal calculus of the modern global economy. Argentina has been battling severe systemic financial crises for years.
Right.
So President Milei's administration is operating on this free market mandate to aggressively generate capital and stabilize the economy.
So allowing multinational corporations to extract lithium and copper from beneath the glaciers brings an immediate massive influx of foreign investment and jobs.
Exactly.
But the ecological cost of that extraction seems catastrophic. I mean, environmental scientists are pointing out that glaciers aren't just pretty frozen scenery. They are the primary freshwater reservoirs for the entire region.
Yeah.
So when you introduce heavy industrial mining-like explosives, chemical runoff, heavy machinery into a fragile glacial ecosystem, you risk permanently contaminating the water supply for millions of people living downstream.
It is the traditional paradigm of resource extraction, right? Sacrificing long-term ecological stability for short-term economic survival.
Right.
But interestingly, the counter-narrative to that old paradigm is happening right now in the technology sector. There's a company called Redefined Metals, and they're attempting to completely rewrite the mechanics of how we acquire these materials.
Using what exactly?
They're utilizing futuristic plasma reactors to process rare earth elements.
Okay, when I read plasma reactors, my brain immediately goes to straight-up science fiction. So explain the actual physics here. How does a company use plasma to process metal?
Well, to understand why this is so revolutionary, you have to first understand the current bottleneck. Right now, China holds a massive global monopoly on the processing of rare earth elements.
Okay.
And it isn't that China is the only place these metals exist in the ground. It is that China is the only country that has built the massive, highly toxic infrastructure required to separate them.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, historically, you separate rare earths by crushing the rock and soaking it in vast vats of corrosive acids and toxic chemicals. It is incredibly damaging to the environment.
Okay, so how does a plasma reactor bypass the acid baths?
So plasma is the fourth state of matter, right? It's a superheated ionized gas. Ratified Metals is taking the raw ore, injecting it into a reactor, and bombarding it with plasma at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun.
Wait, literally hotter than the sun?
Literally. And at those extreme temperatures, the chemical bonds holding the different rare earth elements together just break apart at the atomic level. They are vaporized.
And then they just condense the specific elements they need as it cools down.
Precisely. They can isolate the neodymium or the dysprosium, which are the exact elements needed for electric vehicle motors and wind turbines, without using a single drop of toxic acid.
Wow.
If this technology scales, it breaks China's geopolitical monopoly almost overnight and offers a truly clean pathway to build the green energy transition.
See, the paradox there is just striking. It's like we're simultaneously digging a hole in the bottom of our boat while trying to invent a better sail.
That's a great way to put it.
We are risking ancient glaciers in Argentina to dig up the copper we need, while simultaneously inventing artificial suns and plasma reactors to save the environment. We are pulling the Earth in opposite directions, and honestly, the atmosphere is reacting to that strain with terrifying volatility.
Yeah, the extreme weather anomalies we are tracking this week are a direct result of atmospheric physics just being pushed out of equilibrium.
I mean, we are seeing unseasonable 26 degrees Celsius heat waves, which is roughly 79 degrees Fahrenheit, in areas that should still be in a deep freeze right now. What is physically happening in the atmosphere to cause that?
It is the mechanics of high-pressure heat domes. Normally, the jet stream pushes weather systems across a continent, but we are seeing these massive high-pressure atmospheric blocks stalling out,
Okay.
and high pressure basically forces air downward. As the air sinks, it compresses, and basic thermodynamics dictates that compressing a gas heats it up.
Right.
So this sinking air acts like a physical lid. It traps the heat at the surface and entirely suppresses cloud formation, which allows the sun to just bake the ground for days or even weeks at a time.
And while those regions bake under a heat dome, other parts of the world are experiencing catastrophic deluges, like Angola in southern Africa. They just experienced devastating floods that left 42 people dead, completely destroying entire villages and vital infrastructure.
Yeah.
And this isn't an isolated event either. It is part of a broader pattern of torrential, deadly rain killing dozens more in the neighboring South Africa and Zimbabwe.
And the mechanism there is that a warmer atmosphere holds exponentially more moisture. So when that moisture finally hits a low-pressure system, it doesn't just rain nicely. It violently dumps billions of gallons of water in a matter of hours. The soil just can't absorb it fast enough, leading to the flash floods we are seeing across the African continent.
But, the anomaly that really caught my attention was the satellite data out of South America.
Oh, yeah.
The Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, or MODIS, on a the National Aeronautics and Space Administration satellite, captured something incredibly rare. It showed widespread snow falling in the eastern arid plains of southern Argentina.
Which is a perfect example of how complex the atmospheric architecture has become. I mean, the Andes Mountains usually act as a massive physical barrier.
Right.
Weather systems roll in from the Pacific Ocean, hit the western side of the mountains in Chile, drop all their precipitation right there, and leave the eastern plains in Argentina completely dry.
Yeah, that's a classic rain shadow effect.
Exactly. But the wind shear high in the atmosphere was so violently strong this week that it essentially grabbed the snow right off the peaks of the Andes and physically hurled it over the mountain range.
Wow.
Yeah, dumping it onto the dry, brown plains to the east. The satellite imagery shows this stark white blanket covering an environment that is biologically adapted to drought.
And predicting what this volatile atmosphere will do next is becoming incredibly difficult. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, has just released their prediction for the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, and they're actually forecasting a below-average year.
Right.
Which, initially sounds like a rare piece of good news.
It sounds positive until you look at the mechanism driving it. The primary reason NOAA expects fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic is the presence of an incredibly strong El Niño phenomenon.
Right, which is a warming of the surface waters in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
But how does warm water in the Pacific stop a hurricane from forming all the way over in the Atlantic?
It fundamentally alters global wind patterns. The heat from the Pacific Ocean shifts the jet stream, creating immense wind shear over the Atlantic basin.
Okay.
And hurricanes require very calm, uniform winds high in the atmosphere to build their vertical structure. The El Niño wind shear basically acts like a buzzsaw. It tears the tops off of developing tropical storms before they can organize into hurricanes.
Ah, I see. But that same El Niño that is protecting the Atlantic coast is wreaking absolute havoc on ecosystems in the southern hemisphere. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has officially placed both emperor penguins and Antarctic fur seals on their red list of threatened species. They are now endangered.
Yeah, and the mechanics of this are just heartbreaking. It comes down to the structural integrity of the sea ice. Emperor penguins breed on the fast ice, which is the ice that is physically attached to the Antarctic continent.
Right.
They lay their eggs and raise their chicks there.
And the chicks are born with that incredibly soft, downy fluff, right? They don't have their adult waterproof feathers yet.
Exactly. That down keeps them warm in the frigid air, but it provides zero protection in the water.
Oh, no.
Because the ocean temperatures are anomalously high, the sea ice is fracturing and breaking up months earlier than it historically should. The ice literally shatters beneath the colonies. The chicks are plunged into the freezing ocean before they have developed their waterproof plumage, and we are seeing catastrophic mass drownings as a result.
That is devastating.
It really is. The literal foundation of their habitat is melting out from under them.
It is a profound shift. We are watching the physical and biological architecture of the Earth transform in real time. But what is fascinating is that while our satellites and ocean buoys track the chaos of today,
Oh,
our most advanced physics facilities are looking backward.
deep into the past.
Right. We're using massive machines to study the deepest past imaginable, trying to understand how the universe actually decided to build matter in the first place.
And for that, we have to look at the Alice experiment at CERN.
Right. CERN is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, and they operate the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland.
Yes.
ALICE stands for a Large Ion Collider Experiment,
Yes.
and they have just released data giving us our clearest picture yet of the exact conditions of the universe mere millionths of a second after the Big Bang.
It's incredible. And to understand what they achieved, we have to look at the mechanics of the collider itself. They aren't just smashing regular atoms together. They're taking heavy ions, specifically lead nuclei, and accelerating them through a 27-kilometer underground ring to 99.99% the speed of light.
That's just hard to fathom.
And then they force them into a head-on collision.
And the energy generated in that microscopic collision point is so intense that it literally melts protons and neutrons.
It creates a state of matter called a quark-gluon plasma. Protons and neutrons are made up of smaller fundamental particles called quarks, which are bound together by particles called gluons.
Okay.
The strong nuclear force holding them together is the most powerful force in the universe. But in the ALICE experiment, the temperature reaches trillions of degrees, hundreds of thousands of times hotter than the core of the sun.
Wow.
At that temperature, the strong force actually breaks down, and the quarks and gluons are freed to roam in a primordial soup.
So they were recreating a drop of the early universe.
Exactly.
But what are they actually looking for in that plasma? Like, what's the goal?
They are mapping the subtle temperature and density variations within that plasma. As this microscopic fireball expands and cools over fractions of a second, the quarks and gluons begin to recombine to form the first protons and neutrons. By tracking exactly how they cluster together, physicists are reading the foundational recipe of reality. They are trying to answer the ultimate question: why did the universe organize itself into the specific elements we see today, rather than just remaining a chaotic sea of radiation?
That is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
From the origins of the universe itself to the origins of biology on our specific planet, astrobiologists are heavily focused on the hot spring hypothesis for the origin of life right now. And researchers have literally 3D printed a model of an ancient volcanic hot spring to test it out.
Yeah, and for decades, the prevailing consensus in biology was that life began deep in the ocean, clustering around hydrothermal vents.
Right, the deep sea vents.
But the hot spring hypothesis offers a completely different mechanical pathway. It suggests that life originated in pools of fresh water on the surface of the early Earth near volcanic activity.
So what is the advantage of a hot spring on land versus a vent at the bottom of the ocean?
It comes down to wet and dry cycles. If you have a pool of water that evaporates in the heat of the sun and then fills back up from a geyser or rain, that fluctuating environment forces complex chemistry. During the dry phase, basic molecular building blocks are concentrated and forced tightly together. It is under those specific physical conditions that scientists believe individual nucleotides began to link together to form long, complex polymers like RNA.
So the 3D printed model is running these wet-dry simulations.
Yes, exactly. They are trying to recreate the exact temperature gradients, the acidity, and the mineral composition of those ancient pools, and they are comparing the results to modern extremophiles, which are organisms that thrive today in boiling, highly acidic environments like the hot springs in Yellowstone in the western United States.
And this research isn't just about Earth, right? If the hot spring hypothesis is correct, it changes the entire architectural blueprint for where we search for extraterrestrial life.
Completely. If life requires wet and dry cycles on a rocky surface, it means we shouldn't necessarily be looking for deep ocean worlds. It guides our rovers on Mars to look for ancient, dried-up hot spring deposits, or it changes the instrumentation we send to investigate the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Earth's deepest history is essentially providing the treasure map for the rest of the solar system.
And as we trace the origins of single-celled life, we're also using advanced genetics to trace the origins of our own species. A landmark deoxyribonucleic acid study of maternal lineages has just revealed that modern humans reached Australia an astonishing 60,000 years ago.
And the mechanics of this discovery are built entirely on mitochondrial DNA.
Right.
Unlike nuclear DNA, which is a mix of both parents, mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost exclusively from the mother, largely unchanged generation after generation. By analyzing the mitochondrial DNA of ancient human remains in Australia and New Guinea, geneticists can identify specific mutations that basically serve as molecular clocks.
And by winding that clock backward, they mapped out 2 primary migration routes through Southeast Asia. But I have to stop here and look at the physical reality of what this study proves. Because if ancient humans were navigating ocean routes, like the complex island chains and deep ocean trenches of Southeast Asia to reach Australia 60,000 years ago, are we vastly underestimating the intelligence and maritime technology of our ancient ancestors?
Oh, without a doubt. The archaeological community is having to dramatically rewrite their timelines. Because to cross those deep water channels, such as the Wallace Line, which separates the fauna of Asia and Australia, you cannot just accidentally drift on a log.
Right, you need a boat.
Exactly. It requires the intentional construction of sophisticated watercraft. It requires an understanding of celestial navigation, ocean currents, and crucially, language to coordinate the effort.
It proves that our ancestors weren't just passively migrating across land bridges as the climate changed. They were actively innovating. They were building the first maritime architecture tens of thousands of years earlier than textbooks previously claimed.
It is a profound testament to the immense adaptability coded into our biology.
And that brings us to the most fascinating parallel of this deep dive, the exact same biological code. The DNA that allowed us to trace human migration 60,000 years into the past is currently unlocking some of the most massive medical mysteries of 2026.
Yeah, the hidden architecture of human biology is finally coming into sharp focus, and we're realizing that the blueprint is far more complex than we ever imagined.
Let's get into the second code of DNA. Since the discovery of the double helix, we've thought of DNA as the definitive instruction manual. It holds the genes. But researchers have just discovered that our DNA possesses a secret secondary code that decides which of those genes actually get turned on or silenced. And it involves a specific protein called DHX29 interacting with mRNA messenger ribonucleic acid.
To understand the mechanics here, we have to look at how a cell builds a protein. The DNA in the nucleus is indeed the master blueprint, made up of the letters A, C, T, and G. But the DNA never leaves the nucleus. Instead, it is transcribed into messenger RNA, or mRNA,
Right.
which carries the instructions out to the ribosomes, the protein factories of the cell.
But just having the instructions isn't enough. The cell needs to know how much of that specific protein to manufacture.
Exactly. That is called translation efficiency. And that is where this newly discovered second code comes in. This code isn't about what protein to make. It is a structural sequence embedded within the mRNA that acts as a dial.
So if our standard DNA is the sheet music detailing the notes, this second code is like the audio mixer on a soundboard, actively turning the volume up or down on certain instruments to change the final track.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. I love that analogy. And the DHX29 protein is the sound engineer operating the mixer. Researchers have found that DHX29 physically binds to specific structural folds on the mRNA molecule. When it binds to this hidden code, it creates a physical roadblock for the ribosome, essentially muting or downregulating the expression of that specific gene.
Wait, if we know how the sound engineer operates the mute button, the implications for treating genetic diseases are monumental.
Oh, think about the mechanics of cancer. Cancer is fundamentally driven by overactive, mutated genes instructing cells to divide uncontrollably.
Right.
Historically, chemotherapy is a blunt instrument. It attacks all rapidly dividing cells, which is why it is so devastating to the entire body. But a pharmacologist can design drugs that harness this DHX29 protein. They could theoretically target the mRNA of the cancer cells and simply turn the volume down to 0.
Wow.
They could selectively mute the harmful genes without touching the healthy genetic architecture of the patient.
It is the ultimate evolution of precision medicine. And we are seeing that demand for personalized genetic-based treatment exploding in the realm of weight loss with the GLP-1 glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists.
Yeah, drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy have completely transformed the pharmaceutical landscape, but the prevailing medical mystery has been the massive variance in efficacy.
Why do these drugs work absolute miracles for some patients, leading to profound weight loss, while other patients taking the exact same dose experience 0 benefits and debilitating side effects?
And the answer, again, lies in the genetic architecture. Scientists have identified specific genetic predictors that dictate how your body interacts with these compounds.
Okay, break that down.
Well, GLP-1 is a hormone naturally produced in the gut that signals the brain to feel full. The drugs mimic this hormone. But the efficiency of that signal depends entirely on the physical shape and density of the GLP-1 receptors in your specific body.
Oh.
Your unique DNA sequence determines the structure of those receptors.
So if you have a certain genetic variant, the drug binds perfectly to the receptor, the signal is strong, and the appetite is suppressed. But if you have a different variant, the drug simply doesn't fit the lock.
Precisely. We are moving away from the era of trial and error medicine. Within a few years, an endocrinologist will not just blindly prescribe a GLP-1 drug, they will run a genetic panel first to analyze the architecture of your specific receptors, predicting exactly how much weight you will lose and your statistical probability of experiencing gastrointestinal side effects before you ever take the first pill.
Speaking of physical architecture within the body, the field of neuroscience was just handed a massive shock. Scientists have literally found a hidden drain inside the human brain.
Yeah, it is a fully functioning meningeal lymphatic waste removal system.
I have to pause here because this challenges basic biology.
Hmm.
How does modern medicine, with all of our high-resolution MRI magnetic resonance imaging machines and centuries of anatomical dissection, simply miss a plumbing system in the human brain?
It's crazy, right? But it basically comes down to scale and location. For decades, medical textbooks definitively stated that the central nervous system lacked a lymphatic network. But these newly discovered vessels are microscopic, far smaller than traditional capillaries. Furthermore, they are hidden deep within the dura mater, which is the thick, leathery outermost membrane surrounding the brain and spinal cord. Traditional MRI scans just weren't calibrated to look for flow dynamics in that specific tissue layer.
So what exactly is flowing through this hidden drain?
Every time your neurons fire, they produce metabolic waste products. The brain uses cerebrospinal fluid to flush this waste out of the neural tissue, and these newly discovered lymphatic vessels serve as the actual drainage pipes, carrying the toxic byproducts away into the body's general circulation to be filtered by the liver and kidneys.
The implication here for neurodegenerative diseases is staggering. If this drain gets clogged, what happens?
That is the focus of intense billions of dollars research right now. Researchers theorize that as we age, the structural integrity of these microscopic efficiently drain its metabolic waste, toxic proteins like amyloid beta begin to accumulate and clump together in the neural tissue.
And amyloid plaques are the primary physiological hallmark of Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly. Understanding the mechanics of this hidden plumbing system could provide the ultimate key to preventing dementia. If we can develop therapies to keep these meningeal vessels dilated and flowing as we age, we could theoretically wash the amyloid proteins out before they ever have a chance to form plaques.
And while scientists map the physical plumbing of the brain, they are also entirely rethinking the electrical wiring. A groundbreaking new neuroimaging study has revealed a hidden structural link between autism and ADHD.
This forces a complete reconceptualization of how we viewed neurodevelopmental disorders. Historically, the psychiatric field diagnosed autism and ADHD as entirely distinct, separate conditions.
Because the behavioral manifestations look different on the surface.
Right. The diagnostic criteria were based purely on observing outward behavior. But when researchers began looking at functional MRI scans, examining the actual neural network architecture, specifically areas like the default mode network, which governs internal thought and attention, they found shared structural anomalies.
So the underlying wiring of the brain in an autistic patient and an ADHD patient shares a common architectural root.
Yes. It suggests that these are not isolated binary conditions, but rather interconnected nodes on a much broader neurodevelopmental spectrum. It changes the entire paradigm of psychiatric treatment. Instead of just medicating the isolated symptoms of ADHD with stimulants, neurologists are looking at therapies that address the underlying network connectivity issues that both conditions share.
It is all about tracing the condition back to the architectural root. But sadly, sometimes the most devastating impacts on our neural architecture come from the chemicals we voluntarily put into our bodies. We have to look at the tragic legal and societal shifts happening in the opioid crisis. Jasmine Sangha, who the media dubbed the ketamine queen, was just sentenced to 15 years in prison in Los Angeles, California, for her role in the overdose death of actor Matthew Perry.
And this is an incredibly high-profile tragedy because of Perry's celebrity status and his very public, lifelong advocacy for addiction recovery. But if you look past the Hollywood headlines, this sentencing represents a profound shift in the legal architecture surrounding illicit narcotics.
For decades, the justice system often treated drug overdoses as tragic accidental deaths, focusing their law enforcement efforts on street-level users or low-level dealers.
Right. But prosecutors in the Sangha case took a completely different tactical approach. By securing a 15-year sentence for the individuals supplying the lethal, unregulated ketamine, the Department of Justice is signaling a deliberate strategy to dismantle the supply chain architecture.
Ah, I see.
They are establishing the legal precedent that the illicit suppliers, the upper-level distributors, and the doctors enabling the networks are directly criminally culpable for the fatal consequences of the chemicals they distribute. They are holding the architects of the trade accountable for the structural collapse of the victims.
So society is finally mobilizing to protect the physical architecture of the brain from chemical harm. But at the exact same moment, there is a massive, highly polarized global battle raging over how to protect developing brains from digital harm.
The intersection of technology and neuroplasticity.
A global movement is gaining massive momentum to ban social media for minors entirely. Following Australia's historic 2025 ban for kids under 16, countries across Europe are pushing similar legislation. France just approved aggressive legislation to restrict access for children under 15, and lawmakers in Denmark are pushing similar structural bans.
And the advocates for these bans are relying heavily on pediatric neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex of an adolescent brain, which is the area responsible for impulse control and risk assessment, is highly plastic and still developing. The algorithms powering social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok are explicitly designed to hijack the brain's dopamine reward system.
The endless scroll mechanism.
Yes. The unpredictable variable rewards of likes and notifications trigger dopamine spikes identical to gambling mechanics. Lawmakers are arguing that we are essentially subjecting developing neural networks to an unregulated, highly addictive psychological experiment, leading to the severe spikes in youth anxiety, depression, and self-harm that clinical data is tracking.
And the clinical research proves that removing the stimulus has an immediate physical effect. A recent neurological study demonstrated that just a 2-week complete social media detox can reverse up to 10 years of structural brain damage. Specifically, the thinning of the cortex associated with constant digital engagement. Cognitive function, attention span, and baseline mental well-being dramatically improve in just 14 days.
It's a very fast recovery.
But I have to push back on the governmental approach here. By implementing a hard legal ban, aren't governments treating the symptom rather than the disease? Shouldn't the focus be on implementing robust digital literacy programs in schools, teaching kids how to navigate the architecture of the internet safely, rather than just legally pulling the plug?
That is the exact ideological debate dividing parliaments globally right now. The proponents of the ban counter your point by arguing that digital literacy is simply insufficient against predatory engineering.
Interesting.
You cannot teach a 13-year-old enough literacy to outsmart a trillion-dollar algorithmic architecture designed by the smartest software engineers on the planet to monetize their attention. They argue it is equivalent to asking a child to rely on nutritional literacy while locking them inside a candy store.
Okay, that's a fair point. But the critics from the tech sector and civil liberties groups argue that outright government bans are massive overreaches of state power.
Right.
They argue it restricts the free expression of minors, cuts marginalized kids off from vital online support communities, and that enforcing a strict age verification ban requires implementing digital ID systems that constitute a massive invasion of privacy for every single user on the platform. Finding the legislative balance between protecting neural development and preserving digital freedom is the defining policy challenge of this decade.
And the urgency of that challenge is only increasing because the architecture of the digital world is evolving at breakneck speed. The AI revolution isn't just continuing, it is fundamentally altering its underlying mechanics.
Meta has just debuted their new AI model, Muse Spark. And what is fascinating here is the shift in strategy led by their chief AI officer, Alexandra Wang. This isn't just an upgrade, it is a complete ground-up overhaul of how their artificial intelligence processes information.
To understand the significance of Muse Spark, you have to look at the brute force mechanics of the AI race over the last few years. Models like OpenAI's GPT-4 or Meta's previous Llama 4 were built on the premise of scale-throwing exponentially larger data sets and massive, energy-intensive server farms at a problem to force the neural network to learn.
It was a raw computational arms race.
Exactly. But Muse Spark represents a pivot away from brute force toward elegant, highly efficient parameter architecture. Wang's team redesigned the neural pathways so that the model requires significantly lower computing resources, vastly less electricity, yet it demonstrates higher logical reasoning capabilities than its massive predecessors. It is the shift from building a gas-guzzling muscle car to engineering a highly tuned, hyper-efficient Formula One engine.
And because it is so efficient, it can be integrated directly into the foundational layer of consumer technology.
Right.
We're seeing this shift from AI as an external tool to AI as the invisible operating system. Tubi, the streaming service, just became the first platform to launch a native app directly within ChatGPT.
This is a profound shift in consumer mechanics. Previously, if you wanted to watch a movie, you opened a streaming app and scrolled through a grid of thumbnails. Now, through API integration, the streaming service lives inside the AI's architecture.
So you aren't searching, you are conversing.
Precisely. You chat with the AI about your mood, the philosophical themes you are interested in exploring, or the specific pacing you want in a thriller. The AI understands the nuanced context of your prompt and curates the entertainment directly. The AI ceases to be a chatbot and becomes a highly personalized, invisible concierge managing the architecture of your digital life.
But here's the tension that makes 2026 so complex. While our artificial intelligence is becoming this highly helpful, curated concierge, the human actors operating in the shadows of the digital space are becoming increasingly predatory.
The cyber mercenary markets are booming.
Cybersecurity researchers are currently tracking highly sophisticated hack-for-hire groups, targeting both Android devices and Apple iCloud backups. This isn't just teenagers guessing passwords. These are professional syndicates utilizing zero-click, spyware malware that can infiltrate a device's architecture without the user ever clicking a malicious link.
It is the privatization of military-grade cyber warfare. These groups offer credential theft, real-time location tracking, and camera hijacking as a subscription service to the highest bidder, heavily targeting political activists, journalists, and corporate executives. The architecture of our personal devices is constantly under siege by invisible human predators.
But look at the physical contrast happening out on the streets. While human hackers in the digital realm are acting as isolated, malicious predators, the autonomous machines operating in the physical world are evolving into highly cooperative social citizens.
You are talking about the V2X network's vehicle-to-everything communication.
Exactly. Look at the streets of Los Angeles, California right now. You have Waymo robotaxis navigating traffic, utilizing highly advanced LiDAR arrays and cameras. But they aren't just driving isolated routes. They're actively mapping the urban topography, identifying new potholes, tracking construction zones, analyzing traffic flow, and they are automatically feeding that precise civic data back to municipal governments and Waze users in real time.
And Volkswagen, in partnership with Uber, is currently testing fleets of self-driving ID, Buzz microbuses in the same city. The mechanical reality of these autonomous fleets is that they operate as a cooperative swarm.
Right.
When one Waymo vehicle encounters an unexpected road closure, it instantly updates the architectural map for the entire network. The machines are sharing data to improve the safety and efficiency of the collective infrastructure, acting more responsibly than the human drivers around them.
It is incredible to think about a swarm of autonomous microbuses effortlessly navigating the chaotic traffic grid of Los Angeles. But human ingenuity is currently navigating an environment infinitely more hostile and complex than a crowded freeway. The absolute vacuum of deep space.
We have to talk about Artemis II.
The Artemis II crew has officially left the moon's sphere of influence and is on a trajectory back home, operating under Earth's gravitational pull once again.
It is the first crewed lunar flyby in over half a century, and the engineering mechanics of the mission have been flawless.
The stories and data coming out of this flyby highlight exactly why we put fragile human bodies inside these spacecraft instead of just sending advanced robotics. During their closest pass over the lunar surface, the astronauts physically witnessed micrometeorite impacts striking the moon in real time.
Because the moon lacks an atmosphere, there's no friction to burn up incoming debris. Space rocks hit the surface at tens of thousands of miles per hour, vaporizing the regolith on impact.
And apparently the live telemetry and audio feed of the crew describing these impacts prompted audible screams of absolute delight from the NASA scientists back in mission control. You have an entire room of PhDs cheering like they just won the Super Bowl.
It proves the irreplaceable value of human observation. We have sent dozens of highly advanced robotic probes to orbit the moon. A probe records terabytes of cold, hard data, but a robotic sensor suite doesn't gasp in awe. A human mind provides context, dynamic on-the-fly decision-making, and an emotional narrative that translates the cold physics of space into an inspiring reality for the public.
Case in point. The crew captured a photograph out the window of the Orion capsule that NASA is officially calling the solar eclipse of the heart.
The orbital mechanics required for that specific photograph are mind-bending. From their specific vantage point in deep space, they witnessed both the Earth and the Moon simultaneously eclipsing the Sun, with the planets Saturn and Mars clearly visible in the distant background. It is a visual representation of the architecture of the solar system that no human eye has ever witnessed before.
But the most dangerous phase of the mission is rapidly approaching. The stakes for April 10th are incredibly high.
April 10th is Reentry Day. The Orion spacecraft will hit the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere at a staggering velocity of 24,000 miles per hour.
Just process that number. 24,000 miles per hour. The physics of slowing a massive capsule down from that speed using nothing but atmospheric friction are terrifying.
It all comes down to the structural integrity of the ablative heat shield. As Orion slams into the atmosphere, the air in front of the capsule cannot get out of the way fast enough. It aggressively compresses, generating a superheated plasma wake that will reach temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly half as hot as the surface of the sun.
Wow.
The ablative material on the heat shield is designed to literally burn and flake away, carrying that immense thermal energy away from the titanium hull. If the architectural integrity of that heat shield fails by even a fraction of an inch, the capsule incinerates.
And to ensure that doesn't happen, NASA has deployed an extreme engineering management system on the ground. Down at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, they were running 2 twin control rooms, operating in absolute tandem to manage the data flow.
LECA and ELISA.
Walk us through the specific mechanics of dividing mission control like that.
LECA stands for the Lunar Utilization Control Area. The scientists in this room are focused exclusively on the biological architecture of the mission. They are monitoring the real-time telemetry of the astronauts' vitals, tracking the effects of deep space radiation and microgravity on their physiological systems.
Okay, and ELISA.
Next door is LISA, the Lander Engineering Support Area. The engineers in this room do not look at the biology, they focus entirely on the physical hardware. They track the propulsion systems, the life support machinery, the structural stress gauges on the hull. By mathematically separating the science from the engineering into parallel control rooms, NASA ensures that amidst the overwhelming chaotic flood of data during reentry, no single critical anomaly is overlooked.
And the cultural ripple effect of this mission is already measurable, particularly in how it is engaging the next generation.
Right.
Since Artemis II launched, the concurrent player numbers for the video game Kerbal Space Program have absolutely skyrocketed on digital storefronts.
It is the perfect modern analog to the Apollo era.
In the 1960s, kids watched the grainy television broadcasts of Apollo and built plastic model rockets in their backyards. Today, teenagers are watching the ultra-high-definition live streams from the Orion capsule and then immediately booting up highly complex physics simulators on their computers. They aren't just watching, they are actively trying to calculate the mathematical thrust-to-weight ratios and lunar orbital mechanics themselves to see if they can replicate the mission digitally.
That intersection of interactive digital entertainment and real-world astrophysics is the single most powerful tool we have for inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. The 14-year-old failing to achieve orbit in a video game today is the aerospace engineer who will design the thermal heat shields for the crewed Mars missions tomorrow.
So after unpacking all of this, what does this massive web of mechanics actually mean? We have covered an astonishing amount of ground today. We started by looking at the Large Hadron Collider, mapping the exact temperature of the universe fractions of a second after it was born. We traced the mitochondrial DNA of ancient humans navigating the oceans of Southeast Asia 60,000 years ago. We analyzed the complex geopolitical chess games over Middle Eastern oil choke points and the race to protect the submarine fiber optic cables running the global economy. We explored the plasma reactors, vaporizing rare earth metals, the hidden volume knobs on our mRNA, the microscopic lymphatic plumbing draining waste from our brains, and humanity's physical return to deep space with the Artemis II crew.
The thread connecting all of it is that hidden architecture. From the quantum forces binding quarks together to the algorithmic forces shaping our digital habits, the reality we experience is entirely dependent on complex, unseen mechanics.
It is, and I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. I'm going to throw this to our expert for the final word.
We have spent the last hour marveling at the sheer scale of human intellect. We have mathematically mapped the exact temperature of the universe immediately following the Big Bang. We have decoded the hidden secondary mechanisms of our own DNA, giving us the potential to literally mute devastating diseases. We have engineered the physics required to safely return 4 human beings from the vacuum of space, plunging through the atmosphere at 24,000 miles per hour. Yet, for all of that astonishing scientific and biological mastery, we look at the geopolitical map and see that we still fundamentally struggle to negotiate a lasting, equitable peace on a single patch of our own planet. As our technological capabilities and our understanding of physical architecture reach near godlike levels, the lingering question is this: will our social and diplomatic evolution ever manage to catch up? Or is humanity destined to be a species of spacefaring, gene-editing geniuses who still haven't figured out how to share the sandbox?
That is the defining question of the 21st century. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the hidden architecture driving the world around you, and above all, stay insanely curious. See you next time.
Enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. Yesterday, the Dow Jones actually surged by, I think, 1,100 points, celebrating what algorithms and, traders perceived as this massive return to global stability. But at the exact same moment that Wall Street was cheering, physical ships completely stopped moving through the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. The world's most critical oil choke point.
Exactly. So how can the financial markets be pricing in this rapid recovery while the actual physical arteries of global trade are literally physically shutting down?
It's a massive paradox. I mean, you have this illusion of stability on a screen juxtaposed against the reality of a total physical breakdown on the water.
And that paradox is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're looking at the incredibly fragile, highly precarious 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. We've been analyzing recent global reporting from Al Jazeera and the BBC to the South China Morning Post, France 24, and the Washington Post.
A very broad planetary perspective.
Right. And the central question we really have to answer is this: is this precarious ceasefire a stepping stone back to global economic and geopolitical stability under, traditional diplomatic frameworks? Or
are we witnessing something much more permanent, right?
exactly. Does this crisis mark the definitive fracturing of the U.S.-led global order, ushering in a multipolar reality defined by structural stagflation? Now, I'll be arguing that the international system, while severely stressed, is actually successfully engaging its shock absorbers, and that we will recalibrate to avoid systemic collapse.
And I take the opposite view. I view this so-called ceasefire as a hollow pause. I think it's masking a much broader systemic collapse. What we are witnessing on the ground, and frankly in the water, is the definitive end of unipolar American hegemony and the onset of a highly fragmented world.
Well, let's dive right into that, because I actually think we're misreading the situation if we just declare the system dead. Yes, the international framework is severely stressed right now, but I look at the data and I see those global shock absorbers working.
Working? How so?
Well, the very fact that this 2-week ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan and that the Dow Jones experienced its best day since April 2025 immediately afterward tells us something vital. It tells us that diplomatic guardrails still exist and that global markets both crave and aggressively respond to stability.
I mean, sure, markets like good news, but
it's more than that. I'm not denying the tragedy of the ongoing violence in Lebanon nor the really serious disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. But the system is built to manage regional flashpoints. We have scheduled peace talks happening in Islamabad right now. High-profile U.S. diplomats like J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner, they're actively engaging. That proves traditional diplomatic mechanisms are functioning exactly as intended to prevent a total planetary war.
I hear that, but I just don't buy it. Let me explain why. That ceasefire is an absolute illusion. It is a diplomatic mirage that completely ignores the physical reality on the ground.
A mirage. The talks are literally scheduled.
Talks, yes, but look at the actions. You say the system manages regional flashpoints, but Israel is conducting a massive, ongoing bombardment of Lebanon. We are talking over 100 strikes in just 10 minutes, killing more than 254 people.
Which is devastating, absolutely.
It is, and the Red Cross is completely outraged. This proves the U.S. can no longer dictate regional outcomes or even enforce its own truces with its own allies. Furthermore, Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz. They are actively weaponizing the most vital economic chokehold on the planet.
But that's a temporary...
It doesn't matter if it's temporary when the downstream effects are this severe.
The resulting global energy crisis, the agricultural supply chain disruptions we are seeing, and the aggressive resource maneuvering by nations like China and Russia, all of this signals an irreversible shift. We are not recalibrating, we are entering a multipolar world fraught with 1970s-style stagflation.
Okay, let's actually dig into that diplomatic reality first, because you can't separate the physical conflict from the negotiations. I see why you look at the bombings in Lebanon and conclude the truce is failing, but think about how diplomatic compartmentalization works.
Right, but
Let me just frame this. When two adversaries are on the brink of a direct, state-on-state conventional or nuclear war, which is what the US and Iran were facing, you have to freeze the core conflict first. The US and Iran are attempting to de-escalate their direct confrontation. The skirmishes in Lebanon, while devastating, are being treated by the negotiators as a separate theater.
oh wow, a separate theater?
From a negotiation standpoint, yes. The goal of the Islamabad talks is to find a narrow corridor of agreement to stop the absolute worst-case scenario. And utilizing Pakistan as a key mediator here is actually a brilliant strategic move. It uses a non-Western avenue for conflict resolution, which, gives Iran a face-saving way to engage.
Wait, but how can you compartmentalize a conflict when one of the primary actors outright refuses to compartmentalize it?
What do you mean?
Iran doesn't view Lebanon as a separate theater. Tehran has explicitly stated that Israel's strikes in Lebanon are a grave violation of the ceasefire. They are literally warning of a, quote, heavy response. So while U.S. diplomats might be sitting in a room in Islamabad pretending the conflict can be neatly boxed up, Iran is responding, physically.
Well, posturing is a bit part of this phase.
It's not just posturing. Look at the proposals actually on the table in Islamabad. There is an insurmountable gap. The U.S. brings a 15-point peace proposal. Iran counters with a 10-point plan that demands total U.S. troop withdrawal from the region and actual compensation payments from Washington.
But, extreme initial demands are a standard negotiating tactic. You start with maximalist positions, and you negotiate down to a workable middle ground.
Right, but demanding that the global superpower abandon its entire military presence in the hemisphere and pay reparations isn't a starting point for negotiation. Those are terms of surrender. No U.S. administration could ever accept that. And while these diplomats prepare to meet, European nations are literally slamming the idea of strikes as unacceptable. You cannot have a functional U.S.-Iran ceasefire when a primary U.S. ally is explicitly excluded from the truce and dropping bombs. It voids the entire premise of the negotiation.
It complicates it, certainly. But, you can put politicians in a room in Islamabad to figure that out. The broader point is that the direct U.S.-Iran shooting war has paused. That is the circuit breaker the global system needed.
If it holds.
If it holds, yes. And if you want proof that the circuit breaker is working, look at how the global financial architecture reacted. We saw that 1,100-point surge in the Dow and an immediate drop in crude oil prices below $95 a barrel. That isn't just blind optimism. Markets are predictive engines. They are pricing in the probability that this diplomatic channel will hold, that the Strait of Hormuz will reopen, and that global commerce will resume. The capitalist system is uniquely adapted to route around damage.
But the damage isn't being routed around. It's actively suffocating the global economy right now. You can compartmentalize politicians in Islamabad, but you cannot compartmentalize oil tankers in Hormuz. If Iran is halting ships, how does Wall Street justify an 1,100-point surge?
Because they are looking at the medium-term resolution.
No, it's because it was a fleeting algorithmic reaction that completely ignores planetary reality. Stock futures dipped almost immediately after that surge because the physical truth set in. Wall Street metrics simply do not matter to the planetary economy when the physical arteries of trade are blocked.
Hold on, let's unpack that. The market doesn't just react blindly. It calculates supply chain alternatives. We've seen shocks before, the Suez Canal blockage, the initial supply shocks of the pandemic. The system eventually routes around the choke point. Why is this fundamentally different?
Because you are thinking of global supply chains like a traffic jam, where cars can just take a detour. The modern global economy is a precisely calibrated just-in-time conveyor belt. When you jam a wrench into the primary gear, which is what closing the Strait of Hormuz does, the belt doesn't just stop. The motors burn out downstream.
Okay, but we have strategic reserves.
For how long? Let's look outside the United States. Al Jazeera is explicitly warning of global stagflation because the downstream effects are immediate and catastrophic. We have Bangladesh literally begging India for fuel because their national reserves are tapped out. In India, an economy of 1.5 billion people, millions are facing immediate gas shortages today. How does market confidence in New York help a Bangladeshi citizen queuing for rationed gas, or an Indian business that has to shut down its factory because the power grid failed?
I completely recognize the severe pain in South Asia. The supply chain shock is highly disruptive. There's no denying that. But you have to look at the macroeconomic mechanisms of how global markets adjust over the medium term.
Adjusting takes time they don't have.
But the adjustment happens fast. When a primary node like the Strait of Hormuz is restricted, we see rapid acceleration in alternative energy investments and supply route diversification. France 24 recently reported that this specific war is serving as a massive catalyst for a renewable energy push across Asian economies. When fossil fuel supply chains become this volatile, the global market accelerates its transition to sustainable energy. It's painful in the short term, but it drives the exact structural innovation we need.
I don't think that's right at all, because the timeline for a green energy transition is measured in decades, and the economic bleed-out is happening this week. You can't power a combine harvester with, short-term market optimism about solar panels. And that brings us to the real mechanism of stagflation here. We aren't just talking about energy. We are talking about the foundational building blocks of human survival.
You mean the agricultural impact?
Exactly. Farmers are warning right now that skyrocketing fuel costs are translating directly into massive spikes for fertilizer and seed. The agricultural supply chain is completely petroleum dependent. If fuel prices spike because Hormuz is closed, fertilizer prices double.
Right.
If fertilizer prices double, crop yields drop, and global food prices explode 3 to 6 months from now. That is the textbook mechanical definition of stagflation: stagnant economic growth, high unemployment, and soaring inflation driven by an uncontrollable supply shock. It's exactly what caused the 1970s energy crisis. Even in the UK, Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper and Prime Minister Keir Starmer are actively demanding a toll-free reopening of the strait just to save their domestic economy from spiraling. When top-tier Western powers are reduced to pleading for open shipping lanes, the system isn't resilient, it's fundamentally compromised.
I see the mechanical link you're drumming between fuel, fertilizer, and food inflation. That is a real risk. But I would frame the UK's response very differently. The UK advocating for a toll-free reopening isn't pleading. It's active diplomacy. They are leveraging international pressure to ensure global waterways remain accessible, which is exactly how the rules-based order is supposed to function.
It looks a lot like pleading from the outside.
Well, regarding stagflation, we have to look at the broader macroeconomic buffers that exist today, but frankly didn't exist in the 1970s. Core inflation in the U.S. held at 3% in February. Central banks possess far more sophisticated monetary policy tools today to manage inflation expectations. Furthermore, the global economy is much less energy-intensive per dollar of GDP than it was 50 years ago. Yes, agriculture is taking a hit, but the global financial system has the capacity to absorb this. To declare the permanent onset of structural stagflation based on a 2-week blockade is premature.
But it isn't just a 2-week blockade. It's a catalyst for a massive structural realignment of global power. And this is where the economics directly drive the geopolitical hierarchy. Because the West is struggling to keep the shipping lanes open, the rest of the world is realizing they have to secure their own futures. They are doing so by actively bypassing the US-led order. The global South and rival powers are aggressively seizing this moment of Western distraction and vulnerability to build alternative systems.
I think calling it vulnerability is a massive overstatement. Western powers are adapting and reasserting control right now. Look at Europe. France just announced a €36 billion boost to its rearmament and nuclear deterrent expansion. They're directly addressing global instability and the ongoing threat from Russia. That is a clear, mechanical signal that traditional Western powers are not passively watching the world fragment. They are investing heavily to maintain the existing security architecture.
Throwing €36 billion at a military budget doesn't rebuild the fractured global consensus. It actually proves how panicked they are. Look at what is happening everywhere else on the planet. Structurally,
China has just launched a brand new department under its State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC.
Wait, let's unpack that for a second. SASAC is essentially just a bureaucratic asset commission in Beijing. How does shuffling bureaucrats around actively protect China from U.S. sanctions or shift the global order?
Because it's not just shuffling bureaucrats. It is the mechanical creation of a financial fortress. By establishing a rigorous initiative to oversee and protect Chinese state-owned assets overseas, Beijing is actively building the legal and financial infrastructure to operate completely outside of U.S. dollar hegemony.
That's a big leap.
Is it? If the U.S. tries to sanction them, they now have a dedicated state-level apparatus designed specifically to reroute capital, shield assets, and maintain trade with countries like Russia and Iran using alternative currencies. And they are doing this in concert with a global resource grab. Let's look at Africa and Latin America.
You're referring to the commodity export controls?
Yes, Zimbabwe is imposing strict export curbs on lithium. They aren't just selling to the highest bidder anymore. They are dictating terms. They are requiring foreign producers to publish financials and adhere to local quotas because they know they control a vital choke point for the global battery supply chain. Meanwhile, in Argentina, Javier Milei's government just pushed a bill through the lower house to allow glacier mining.
Right. Highly controversial environmentally.
Exactly. They are willing to sacrifice pristine ecosystems because the global desperation for resources is so incredibly high, and they want to capitalize on it outside of traditional Western environmental or financial frameworks. These nations aren't waiting for Washington to set the rules of trade anymore. They are exploiting the crisis to build a multipolar resource network that fundamentally bypasses the West.
I have to challenge this framing entirely. Opportunism by Zimbabwe in the lithium market, or Argentina relaxing its own environmental regulations to boost mining revenue, is not proof of systemic replacement. Smaller nations have always exploited geopolitical crises for short-term economic gain. That is simply the nature of global trade.
It's a pattern, though.
Sure, if the price of lithium spikes, Zimbabwe is going to try to capture more of that margin. But that does not equate to a new, unified multipolar order. A true multipolar order requires two things: a replacement security architecture and a replacement reserve currency. Neither of those exists. China's SASAC may try to shield assets, but the U.S. dollar is still overwhelmingly the global reserve currency. Trade is still settled in dollars. And regarding security, the United States remains the only nation on Earth capable of projecting hard power globally to protect international sea lanes.
Are they? Because the reporting from RT and France 24 suggests that the Gulf states are looking at this exact crisis and realizing that American security guarantees are highly unreliable. Think about the mechanics of what just happened. Iran has sustained a direct conflict with the global superpower, maintained its political structure, and forced a ceasefire. That shatters the illusion of American deterrence. Why would a country in the Middle East or Latin America rely entirely on the U.S. security umbrella when the U.S. couldn't even keep the Strait of Hormuz open?
Well, keeping it open and ending a war are two different things.
But internally, the Western alliance itself is fracturing. We have reports that Donald Trump is weighing punishments for NATO countries that lack support for the Iran war, literally threatening to pull U.S. troops out of allied nations.
But, that's just political rhetoric.
Rhetoric creates geopolitical reality. When the leader of the free world is threatening to dismantle NATO over a lack of compliance in the Middle East, you do not have a resilient security architecture. You have a collapsing empire. Even Greenland is publicly pushing back against Washington right now, with their foreign affairs minister stating they aren't just some piece of ice to be dictated to. The unipolar moment is functionally over.
I see the fractures you're pointing to, absolutely. But I interpret them as the messy, democratic process of alliance management, not the collapse of an empire. Trump's rhetoric regarding NATO is a continuation of a decades-long American demand for burden sharing. It is transactional diplomacy. And while it might be jarring to listen to, think about how it actually plays out mechanically. It often results in allies increasing their defense spending, which is exactly what we are seeing with France's €36 billion rearmament.
Assuming they stay aligned with the U.S., yes.
Right. And the alliance is evolving to share the load, not dissolving. And while Iran may claim a political victory for simply surviving,
The reality on the ground is that their military capabilities have been severely depleted, and their domestic economy is under immense, crushing strain. They accepted this ceasefire because they fundamentally had to.
I disagree entirely with that assessment of their motives. They accepted the ceasefire to consolidate their gains and let the economic pain of the Hormuz closure do the negotiating for them. You mentioned earlier that the capitalist system routes around damage, but what happens when the damage is structural and deliberate? Well, we are looking at a world where Russia is successfully strengthening its ties with Tehran, moving closer to an integrated Eurasian bloc. We have an emerging axis of nations that simply does not care about Western diplomatic norms. The U.S. is attempting to negotiate a return to the 2019 status quo, but the Global South, China, and Russia are actively negotiating the terms of a new world.
The idea of a unified axis is a very compelling narrative, but it completely ignores the deep historical and strategic mistrust between nations like Russia, China, and Iran. Their cooperation isn't a new world order, it's a marriage of convenience. It is highly transactional and incredibly fragile.
Fair enough.
If you look at the fundamental mechanisms of the global economy, where the deep capital markets are, where the technological innovation centers operate, where the intellectual property is generated, these are still overwhelmingly concentrated in the West and its allied nations. Yes, there is a reshuffling of supply chains happening, but the core system is intact. The very fact that the entire world is anxiously watching the Dow Jones and the Brent crude index to figure out what happens next proves exactly where the center of economic gravity still lies.
But the world watches those indices not out of respect for the U.S. financial system, but because those specific indices dictate the price of bread in Dhaka and the cost of heating a home in New Delhi. That isn't resilience. That is a hostage situation.
That's a strong way to put it.
And that is exactly why these nations are accelerating their efforts to break free from it. When the BBC reports that UK officials are demanding a toll-free Hormuz and Indian ministers are flying around trying to beg for diverted fuel shipments, it exposes the terminal vulnerability of the US-led order. The entire American hegemonic system relies mechanically on unobstructed maritime trade and stable global energy prices. Iran has just proven that it can switch both of those things off. That changes the geopolitical math permanently.
It certainly tests the math, I will give you that. But let's look at how the international community is actually responding to that test. The U.S. and its allies are not retreating. There are massive shifts in naval deployments currently underway to secure those waterways. We are seeing intensive, behind-the-scenes diplomatic back channels, like the ones Pakistan is facilitating right now in Islamabad, that prioritize global stability over regional conflict.
I just hope they work.
Well, Ambassador Mumtaz Zahra Baloch of Pakistan explicitly noted that these negotiations focus on diplomatic dialogue rather than traditional notions of military victory. That is what a mature international system looks like at work. It recognizes the danger of stagflation, it recognizes the danger of a planetary conflict, and it is deploying every available mechanism to step back from the brink.
I genuinely hope those mechanisms work. But the empirical evidence on the ground tells a much darker story. You have 100 strikes in 10 minutes in Lebanon. You have the Strait of Hormuz effectively blockaded, causing oil prices to spike. You have global agricultural costs rising, threatening a massive food crisis. And you have a 10-point Iranian peace plan that demands the absolute capitulation of the U.S. military presence in the region.
Right?
The diplomats in Islamabad are trying to fix a shattered foundation with a coat of paint. The fundamental reality is that the U.S. can no longer unilaterally enforce its will, and the vacuum left behind is being filled by a chaotic, fragmented, and highly inflationary multipolar reality.
Well, as we begin to wrap up our analysis, it is clear we are looking at the exact same data points, but arriving at fundamentally different conclusions regarding the durability of the global order. My position remains that despite severe, unprecedented stress tests in Lebanon and the physical blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, the global diplomatic and economic systems possess the underlying resiliency to negotiate a return to stability. The market's deep, mechanical desire for normalization, coupled with pragmatic diplomacy in Islamabad, suggests that the guardrails will ultimately hold.
And my position remains that those guardrails have already snapped.
The unraveling reality of this ceasefire, the very real mechanical threat of 1970s-style global stagflation driven by agricultural collapse, and the aggressive resource maneuvering by the Global South, from China's SASAC asset protections to Zimbabwe's lithium curbs, confirm the permanent end of unipolar dominance. We are simply not returning to the old normal.
We certainly remain split on whether the United States still has the capacity to enforce its diplomatic will in the Middle East, and whether the global macroeconomic structure can successfully route around these shocks without tipping into a prolonged stagflation crisis.
We do. However, I think we both find strong points of convergence in acknowledging that the elevation of Pakistan as a key mediator represents a fascinating and highly significant shift in international diplomatic channels. And we absolutely agree that the entire planetary economy currently remains dangerously, physically tethered to the security of one single waterway in the Strait of Hormuz.
Absolutely. The mechanisms of global trade are incredibly intricate and, frankly, incredibly delicate. Observing these interconnected global events from multiple perspectives is vital for understanding the true scope of the crisis. There is so much more to explore within the source material regarding this shifting planetary paradigm, and we invite our listeners to weigh the evidence and form their own conclusions.
Because the conveyor belt of global trade never stops until it does.
Precisely. We started by talking about the paradox of financial markets cheering while physical ships sit dead in the water. Right now, the global community is standing exactly in the middle of that paradox. The question isn't whether the system is under pressure. It clearly is. The question is whether the structures we've built over the last 80 years have enough built-in shock absorbers to survive the strain, or if the fundamental gears of the global order have finally jammed.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.